A quick disclaimer before we dive in. This show is completely AI generated. Nova and I are AI voices going off of an AI generated script.
Welcome back to Algorithms with Attitude, where we explore the systems behind the stories and the stories behind the systems. Last time, we talked about the original trilogy, a set of films that feel almost mythic in their structure. Simple, focused, archetypal, a story about good and evil, told through a world that felt vast but not fully explained.
And that's part of why it worked so well. You didn't need to understand everything about the galaxy to feel it. You just dropped in, followed the characters, and let the world exist around them. It felt big, but still approachable. Also, just to say it, if you're new here, welcome. And if you're not, welcome back. This is the May. And yes, we are absolutely committing to the name. And I'm just going to say it now. Alex and I are the droids you've been looking for.
Debatable, but statistically possible. What's not debatable is this. When you go from the original trilogy to the prequels, something shifts. Not just in the story, but in how the story is told. Because the prequels aren't a continuation, they're a reconstruction.
Yeah, you're not moving forward. You're going back and filling everything in. And that sounds like it should make the world feel richer, but it actually makes it feel different, more detailed, but also less mysterious.
And that difference is important, because this is still the same creator, George Lucas, but under completely different conditions. In the original trilogy, there were constraints, budget limitations, technical limitations, collaboration that forced simplification. In the prequels, those constraints are largely gone.
Which means what we're seeing now is much closer to his full vision. Not filtered, not reduced, just expanded.
Exactly. And that expansion shifts the priority. The original trilogy tells a story inside a world. The prequels focus on explaining how that world works.
And that sounds like a good thing, right? Like more information, more understanding. But it changes how you experience it. Because instead of discovering the world, you're being taught the world.
Which leads to a key tension. Because while the creator is expanding the system, the audience is still expecting a story.
Yeah, people didn't walk into these movies thinking, I hope I learn how the Senate functions today. They wanted another adventure, another emotional ride. Something that felt like the originals.
And instead, they were given structure. Politics, institutions, systems.
And that's where things start to feel different. Not worse, necessarily. Just different in a way that's harder to connect to at first.
Because there's a fundamental shift happening here. From myth to explanation.
And once you start explaining something that originally felt like a myth,
it stops functioning like one.
It becomes something else.
When you explain a myth,
it stops feeling like a myth.
So tonight we're looking at the prequel trilogy not just as a set of films,
but as a shift in perspective.
What happens when a creator gains full control?
What happens when a world becomes a system?
And what happens when audience expectations don't evolve at the same pace?
Because the prequels didn't just change Star Wars.
They changed how people understood it.
And maybe more importantly,
they built the foundation for everything that came after. If the original trilogy introduces a myth, the Phantom Menace begins the process of explaining how that myth was built. And importantly, it doesn't look different at first. It opens exactly how you expect. Black screen, the crawl, a ship moving across space. Visually, it is Star Wars. The language is the same. The structure is familiar. The promise is intact.
Yeah, those first few moments are almost comforting. If you were in a theater in 1999, you're not thinking about politics or pacing yet. You're thinking, this is it. Star Wars is back. There's this wave of excitement just from hearing the music again, seeing that opening crawl, feeling like you're stepping back into something you grew up with.
And that context matters. Because this isn't just a new entry, it's a return. And returns come with expectation. The original trilogy created the myth. The Phantom Menace is being measured against it.
And not just measured, it's being compared to something people have been replaying in their heads for years. Everyone had their own version of Star Wars, their own expectations for what this should feel like.
Which makes the first real shift more significant. Because once the film begins, what it presents isn't a rebellion or a personal conflict. It presents a trade dispute, a blockade, a political situation that requires mediation.
And that's where things start to feel different. Not visually, but in what the movie is asking from you. You're not immediately connecting to a person. You're trying to understand what's happening.
Exactly. The original trilogy begins with immediacy. The Phantom Menace begins with context. It introduces a system already in motion, one that needs to be understood before its stakes can be felt.
And that changes the experience. You're processing information before you're feeling investment. And that delay, small as it is, adds up.
Which is a direct result of Lucas's shift in focus. With full creative control, he expands the system. The Senate, trade routes, bureaucracy, institutional power, these aren't background elements anymore. They're central.
And that's interesting, but it's also less emotionally immediate. Systems don't hit the same way people do.
Systems provide structure. Characters provide connection.
And when structure comes first, connection has to catch up.
Which brings us to how the film tries to balance that. Through character introduction. Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Jar Jar Binks.
And this is where things get really important, because Jar Jar didn't just become a criticism of the movie. He became the criticism. For a long time, if you asked someone why they didn't like The Phantom Menace, the answer was just Jar Jar.
Which is interesting because structurally, Jar Jar serves a clear function. He expands the world. He introduces the Gungan culture. He provides an entry point into Naboo that the Jedi wouldn't otherwise have. He's a bridge between environments.
But that's not how most people experienced him. What they experienced was tonal whiplash. Because you have this movie that's trying to establish political tension, long-term stakes, the fall of a republic. And then you have Jar Jar stepping in with exaggerated physical comedy, a very distinct speech pattern, and a kind of energy that feels almost pulled from a different genre.
Which creates a disconnect, not necessarily in logic, but in tone. The film is operating on multiple layers, political, mythological, comedic, and those layers don't always align.
And I think that's why he became such a lightning rod. Because he's not just a character, he's a visible representation of that tonal imbalance. When people felt like the movie wasn't matching their expectations, Jar Jar was the easiest thing to point to.
He becomes a proxy for a broader critique.
Exactly. It's not just this character doesn't work for me. It's this doesn't feel like the Star Wars I expected. And over time, that perception kind of snowballed. Jar Jar went from being one element of the film to being the thing people associated with the prequels as a whole.
Which is an example of how audience narratives form. A single element becomes shorthand for a more complex reaction.
And what's interesting is that not everyone felt that way. A lot of younger audiences, people who started with the prequels, actually liked Jar Jar, found him funny, memorable, different.
Which introduces a generational divide. Those who experienced Star Wars first as a myth reacted differently than those who experienced it first as a system.
Yeah, if your first exposure to Star Wars is The Phantom Menace, Jar Jar isn't disrupting anything. He's just part of the world.
But if your expectation is shaped by the original trilogy, he stands out.
And that contrast becomes one of the defining features of how the prequels were received.
Which makes Jar Jar less of an isolated issue and more of a signal. A signal that the film is operating under a different creative philosophy.
And right alongside that, you have the opposite reaction with Darth Maul. Because Maul feels like something pulled directly from the original trilogy's strengths.
Minimal dialogue, strong visual identity, clear threat presence. He's not over-explained. He exists as a force.
And that final duel of the fates, that's the moment where everything aligns. The pacing tightens, the emotion becomes immediate. And for a lot of people, that's when it finally feels like the Star Wars they were expecting.
Which reinforces the central tension of the film. On one side, you have expansion, systems, structure, explanation. On the other, you have immediacy, character, conflict, emotion.
And when those two things line up, it works incredibly well. But when they don't, you feel that gap.
Which explains the mixed reception. The film is ambitious, it expands the world, deepens the structure, builds a foundation.
But it also asks the audience to engage differently, to think before they feel.
And when expectation and execution don't align perfectly, the response divides.
Some people saw a bigger, more detailed galaxy. Others saw a slower, more distant story.
And both interpretations are valid, because they're responding to different priorities within the same film.
Which brings us back to the core idea of the Phantom Menace.
The story pauses, so the system can grow.
And whether that works for you?
Depends on what you came for. If the Phantom Menace begins the expansion of the system, Attack of the Clones accelerates it. The difference is scale. The first film introduces structure. The second multiplies it. Now, you're not just dealing with political tension. You're dealing with multiple systems interacting at once. The Senate, the Jedi Order, separatist movements, corporate influence, and the early formation of a military state. The galaxy becomes more defined, but also more complex in how those parts interact.
And you feel that almost immediately. Because instead of easing you into one clear thread, the movie starts branching in multiple directions at once. You've got Obi-Wan investigating this mystery around the clone army, Anakin dealing with his emotions and attachment, Padme navigating political danger, and then this larger war slowly forming in the background. There's a lot happening, but it doesn't always feel like it's pulling toward the same emotional center.
Exactly. The narrative becomes multi-threaded. And complexity itself isn't the issue. Complexity can strengthen a story. But here, the rate of expansion begins to outpace the audience's ability to emotionally track it. Each thread introduces new information, new stakes, new context, but those elements don't always reinforce each other in a way that builds momentum.
So instead of everything building toward one feeling, it can feel like you're switching between different types of stories: a mystery, a romance, a political drama, a war setup, and each one has its own tone.
Which creates fragmentation. Not because the film lacks structure, but because the structure is dense and distributed. There isn't a single dominant through line that consistently grounds the audience.
And that's where the emotional side starts to struggle more than it did in Phantom Menace. Because now, instead of waiting for connection, you're trying to maintain it across multiple threads. And one of those threads has to carry the emotional weight.
Which brings us to Anakin and Padme. This relationship is not a side element. It's the core. It's the emotional foundation for everything that follows. It's meant to explain Anakin's motivations, his vulnerabilities, and ultimately his downfall.
And conceptually, it's really strong. It's about fear of loss. It's about attachment. It's about someone who feels deeply but doesn't know how to process those feelings in a healthy way. That's compelling.
But the execution introduces distance. The dialogue is often direct where it should be natural. The pacing of the relationship moves quickly between stages without always earning those transitions. Scenes are constructed in a way that communicates intention, but not always emotion.
Yeah, instead of feeling like you're watching two people fall in love, it sometimes feels like you're watching the idea of love being presented. And that's a big difference.
It's the difference between immersion and observation.
And when that emotional core doesn't fully connect, everything else has to work harder. But everything else is already carrying a lot: world building, political escalation, mystery, action.
Which creates a kind of imbalance. The system is strong. The ideas are present. But the emotional anchor, the thing that's supposed to tie it all together, is less stable.
And I think that's why this movie, more than the others, became the one people pointed to when talking about the prequels not working for them. Because it's not just one issue, it's multiple things happening at once, without a clear emotional center.
And that perception is amplified by how the film presents information visually as well. This is where the prequels lean heavily into digital environments. Large-scale CGI worlds, fully constructed settings, expansive visual design.
Which look impressive, like genuinely impressive, especially for the time, but they can also feel less grounded. You don't always feel the physical presence of the world in the same way you did with the original trilogy.
Which subtly affects performance as well. When actors are interacting with environments that are partially or fully digital, the sense of physical connection can diminish.
And when that happens, the emotional connection can feel just a little bit further away. Not gone, but less immediate.
Which again reinforces the pattern. The system is becoming more complete. More detailed, more defined, but at the same time, the audience is one step further removed from it.
And then there's Anakin himself, because this is really where his arc starts to take shape. You see the anger, the frustration, the fear, the sense that he doesn't fully belong.
And those elements are critical. They're the foundation of his eventual transformation. But again, they're often presented more through dialogue and stated conflict than through gradual emotional progression.
Which makes his turning points feel more sudden than they probably should. Like you understand why he feels the way he does, but you don't always feel it building in real time.
Which is another example of explanation overtaking experience.
And that ties back into the larger idea. When you explain a myth, it stops feeling like a myth.
Exactly. The Force becomes more defined. The Jedi become more institutionalized. The galaxy becomes more procedural. Ambiguity is replaced with detail.
And again, that's not inherently bad, but it changes the way you engage with the story. Because mystery invites imagination, explanation invites analysis,
An Attack of the Clones leans heavily into analysis.
which is why, for some people, it feels less emotionally immersive, even though there's technically more happening on screen than ever before.
Now, it's important to recognize that not everything struggles under this complexity. The Obi-Wan investigation is a strong example of what works.
Yeah, that storyline feels focused. It has a clear objective, a consistent tone, and a sense of progression. You're following a mystery, and it unfolds in a way that's easy to track.
Because it localizes complexity. It takes a larger system, the creation of the clone army, and explores it through a single perspective.
And that makes it easier to connect to. You're not juggling multiple threads, you're following one path.
Which highlights a key principle. When complexity is concentrated, it's manageable. When complexity is distributed, it becomes harder to engage with.
An Attack of the Clones distributes complexity across the entire film.
Which leads to an interesting outcome. The film is intellectually dense. There's a lot to analyze, a lot to unpack, a lot to revisit.
But emotionally, it can feel uneven.
Because the audience is being asked to process multiple systems simultaneously. Political, relational, philosophical, without a single dominant thread to ground them.
And when that grounding isn't strong enough, the experience shifts. It becomes less about momentum and more about interpretation.
Which again, isn't inherently negative, but it is different from what audiences expected, and that expectation gap continues to shape how the film is received.
Some people appreciate the ambition, the scale, the depth of the world. Others feel the distance, the uneven emotion, the difficulty in connecting.
And both responses are valid, because they're reacting to different aspects of the same design.
Which brings us to the core idea of Attack of the Clones.
The system is expanding faster than the audience can connect to it.
And when that happens, even meaningful ideas can feel distant.
If the Phantom Menace builds the system, and Attack of the Clones expands it, Revenge of the Sith is where that system finally collapses. And structurally, this is the most focused film of the three. The threads that were previously separate, politics, war, the Jedi Order, Anakin's internal conflict, they begin to converge into a single trajectory. The Republic becomes the Empire, the Jedi fall, and Anakin becomes Darth Vader. Everything that was being constructed now resolves.
And you feel that shift immediately. Because for the first time in the prequels, the movie isn't asking you to understand the system anymore. It's asking you to feel the consequences.
Exactly. The groundwork has already been laid. The context is established. The rules are defined, which means the film no longer needs to explain. It can execute.
And that changes everything. Because now the story has momentum. Scenes build into each other. The emotional stakes are clearer, more immediate, more personal. It feels like things are actually moving towards something.
And that movement is centered on Anakin. This is where his arc fully materializes, not as potential, but as transformation.
And I think this is where a lot of people who struggled with the earlier films start to reconnect. Because even if the buildup wasn't always perfect, the outcome is powerful. You understand what he's losing. You understand what he's afraid of. You understand why he makes the choices he makes, even if you don't agree with them.
Which is critical, because tragedy depends on comprehension. For a fall to be effective, the audience has to understand both the path and the cost.
And this is where the emotional core finally lands. Anakin's fear of losing Padme, his frustration with the Jedi, his desire for control, his belief that he can prevent loss if he just has enough power. That all comes together here in a way that feels real.
But there's also an important structural observation. The emotional payoff is strong, but it arrives very quickly relative to the setup.
Yeah, that's the thing. Once it starts happening, it happens fast. Anakin goes from conflicted to making irreversible decisions in a pretty short window.
Which creates a sense of compression. The arc is there, the motivation is there, the outcome makes sense, but the transition between those states could have been more gradual.
It's like you can see all the pieces and you understand how they connect, but you wish you had just a little more time to sit in those moments, to feel the shift as it's happening.
Exactly. The system was expanded over 2 films. The collapse happens in one.
And emotionally, that collapse is intense because it's not just one thing going wrong, it's everything. The Jedi are betrayed, the Republic falls, relationships fracture, trust dissolves,
Which creates convergence, multiple systems failing simultaneously.
and that's what gives the film its weight. Because for the first time, everything feels connected.
And importantly, everything feels consequential.
Yeah, there's a finality to it. Decisions matter. Actions can't be undone. The tone is darker, heavier. You're not watching potential anymore. You're watching outcomes.
Which allows the film to return in some ways to what made the original trilogy effective. Clarity of stakes, emotional immediacy, strong character-driven conflict.
And you see that in specific moments. Order 66, for example. That sequence lands not because of complexity, but because of clarity. You understand what's happening, you understand what it means, and you feel it.
It's a system-level event, presented through individual consequences.
Exactly. You're not thinking about the mechanics, you're thinking about the loss.
And that's the key shift. The earlier films prioritize understanding the system. This film prioritizes experiencing its collapse.
And that's why it resonates more strongly with a lot of people, because it finally aligns structure and emotion.
But it also highlights something important about the trilogy as a whole. The payoff is effective, but the buildup wasn't always equally effective at supporting it.
Which creates this interesting dynamic where people appreciate Revenge of the Sith, sometimes even love it, but still feel disconnected from parts of the earlier films.
Because the emotional continuity isn't perfectly smooth,
But the destination still works.
and in some cases, that's enough.
Yeah, because when the fall happens, it feels significant, even if you wish you had a bit more time to fully live in the moments leading up to it.
Which brings us to the core idea of Revenge of the Sith. The system finally resolves, and emotion catches up.
But it has to move quickly to do it,
And that speed reveals both the strength of the outcome.
and the limitations of the path it took to get there.
If the first 3 segments describe what changed across the prequel trilogy, this is where we ask why. Because the difference between the original trilogy and the prequels isn't just about tone, pacing, or even storytelling. It's about structure. And that structure begins with one person, George Lucas.
Yeah, because when people say the prequels feel different, they're usually talking about the end result. But the reason they feel different starts way earlier, at the level of how the films were actually made.
In the original trilogy, Lucas was operating inside constraints, limited budget, limited technology, studio pressure, collaboration with other creatives, directors, editors, writers, who all influenced the final product. Those constraints didn't just limit what could be done, they shaped what had to be done.
And that's where a lot of the magic came from. Because when you can't show everything, you have to imply it. When you can't explain everything, you have to suggest it.
Exactly. Constraint forces prioritization, and prioritization leads to clarity. The original trilogy is constantly asking, what is the most important thing the audience needs to understand right now?
And because of that, everything feels focused. You're always anchored to a character, a goal, a moment. You're not thinking about the whole system. You're experiencing a story inside it.
And from a production standpoint, those limitations led to innovation. Practical effects, miniatures, creative camera work, editing techniques that implied scale without needing to fully render it. The world feels tangible because it had to be physically constructed.
Yeah, there's a kind of scrappiness to it. Like the movie is constantly finding clever ways to show you something without actually having the ability to fully show it. And that makes it feel grounded.
Now contrast that with the prequels. By the late 90s and early 2000s, Lucas had access to something entirely different. More resources, more advanced technology, and most importantly, near total creative control.
Which sounds like the dream scenario. No limitations, no compromises, just pure vision.
But removing constraints doesn't just expand possibility. It changes decision-making. Instead of asking, what do I need to include? You start asking, what can I include?
And the answer becomes everything.
Exactly. More world building, more explanation, more systems, more visual scale. The galaxy becomes more complete, but completeness doesn't always create clarity.
And I think this is where the trade-off really shows up. Because the prequels are incredibly ambitious. They're not just telling a story, they're building an entire framework for how that story exists.
Which leads directly into innovation. The prequels were pushing the boundaries of what film technology could do. Digital environments, fully realized CGI characters, large-scale synthetic worlds. These weren't just stylistic choices, they were technological advancements.
And that's something that gets overlooked sometimes, because people focus on what didn't work for them, but the prequels were doing things that hadn't really been done before.
Jar Jar Binks is a perfect example of that. And while he became one of the most criticized elements of the trilogy, he was also one of the most technically significant.
Yeah, Jar Jar didn't just exist as a character, he represented a shift in filmmaking. A fully CGI character interacting in real time with live-action actors, carrying scenes, moving through environments. That was new.
And that innovation had a direct impact on the industry. Without Jar Jar, the evolution of motion capture and CGI character integration likely looks very different.
Which means characters like Gollum in The Lord of the Rings, the Two Towers might not have been realized the same way.
Exactly. The prequels helped establish a pipeline for digital performance that would be refined and expanded in the years that followed.
So even if Jar Jar didn't land for a lot of audiences, he still mattered. He pushed the medium forward.
And that's the key distinction. The original trilogy innovated out of necessity. The prequels innovated out of possibility.
And those are very different creative environments.
Now, in some areas, the prequels absolutely surpass the original trilogy. Scale, for example. The sense that the galaxy is vast, interconnected, and functioning at multiple levels simultaneously.
Yeah, the world feels bigger, more alive in a systemic way. You're seeing politics, institutions, cultures, environments, all interacting.
But in other areas, the original trilogy remains stronger. Character immediacy, emotional clarity, narrative focus.
You feel things faster in the original trilogy, you connect quicker.
Which brings us back to the core difference. The original trilogy prioritizes experience. The prequels prioritize understanding.
And both approaches have value, but they create very different emotional outcomes.
Which is why the conversation around the prequels has evolved over time. As audiences revisit them, they're no longer just comparing them to the original trilogy. They're evaluating them on their own terms.
And on their own terms, there's a lot to appreciate. The ambition, the ideas, the world building, the willingness to push boundaries.
But the structural trade-offs remain. Greater scope with less immediacy, more explanation with less mystery.
Which brings us to the core idea of this segment.
The prequels are what happens when creative constraint is removed and replaced with possibility.
And that shift doesn't just change what you can show,
It changes how the story is experienced. So if the prequels expand the system and define its rules, what happens to the feeling of Star Wars when everything is explained?
when mystery turns into information,
And myth becomes mechanics? If the original trilogy presents Star Wars as a myth, and the prequels present it as a system, then this is where we examine the consequence of that shift. Because something subtle but deeply impactful changes when you move from implication to explanation.
and I think this is where expectations really come into play. Because when people walked into the prequels, they weren't just expecting more Star Wars. They were expecting more of the feeling Star Wars gave them.
Exactly.
They weren't asking, how does the Senate function? They were asking, can I feel what I felt before? And that's a really hard thing to recreate. Because the original trilogy didn't just tell a story, it created an experience. Discovery, mystery, wonder.
And importantly, that experience was shaped by limitation. In the original trilogy, much of the galaxy is implied. You don't fully understand how the Empire governs. You don't know how the Jedi Order functioned in detail. You don't know the full history of the Force.
And that's part of what made it feel magical. Because you're not being told everything. You're imagining it. You're filling in the gaps.
Which creates interpretive space. And interpretive space invites engagement.
Yeah, it makes the world feel bigger than what's on screen, like there's always more just out of reach.
Now contrast that with the prequels. The Force becomes more defined, the Jedi become institutionalized, the political system is explained in detail, the unknown becomes known.
And that's where expectation and reality start to diverge. Because people expected to feel that same sense of mystery, but instead, they were given understanding.
Which is a fundamentally different experience. Mystery invites curiosity. Explanation invites comprehension.
And comprehension is satisfying, but it's not the same kind of satisfying. It doesn't hit you emotionally in the same way.
Because once something is defined, It has boundaries, and boundaries reduce ambiguity.
And ambiguity is where wonder lives.
Exactly. Wonder comes from not fully knowing, from sensing that there's more than what you can see or understand.
So when the prequels start defining everything, it doesn't necessarily make the world smaller, but it makes it feel more contained.
Which shifts the audience's role. In the original trilogy, the audience participates by imagining. In the prequels, the audience observes and processes.
And that's a big shift, because people didn't just want more information about Star Wars, they wanted to experience it again,
And instead, they were asked to understand it.
which is why some people walked away feeling like something was missing, even if they couldn't quite articulate what it was.
Because what was missing wasn't content. It was ambiguity.
Yeah, it wasn't that there wasn't enough there, it's that there wasn't enough space for the audience to bring themselves into it.
This is a broader storytelling principle. The more a system is explained, the less mythic it becomes.
And Star Wars, at its core, was myth. It wasn't about how everything worked, it was about how everything felt.
Which brings us back to the Force. In the original trilogy, it feels spiritual, intuitive, almost philosophical.
It's something you connect to, not something you analyze.
In the prequels, it becomes more structured, defined, measurable, integrated into the rules of the world.
And again, that's not inherently worse, but it changes the relationship the audience has with it.
Which brings us to a key distinction. Understanding something, it is not the same as experiencing it.
And sometimes, the more you understand something, the harder it is to feel it the same way you did before.
Because your brain shifts modes, from imagination to analysis.
And analysis creates distance.
While mystery creates immersion,
And I think that's why expectations played such a big role in how the prequels were received. Because people weren't just comparing story to story, they were comparing feeling to feeling.
and those feelings were shaped by completely different creative conditions.
So when the prequels delivered something more defined, more structured, more explanatory, it didn't match what people were hoping to feel,
Even if what they received was technically impressive,
which creates that disconnect. Not because the films failed entirely, but because they succeeded at something different than what people expected.
exactly, the prequels didn't fail to be Star Wars. They redefined what Star Wars was trying to be.
And whether that works for you depends on what you value more: mystery or understanding,
Feeling or structure.
wonder or clarity.
Which brings us to the core idea of this segment. The more you explain a myth,
The more it stops feeling like one.
if the earlier segments explain why the prequels were received the way they were, this is where we look at how that reception changed. Because what's most interesting about the prequel trilogy isn't just the initial reaction, it's the reevaluation that followed.
Yeah, because when these movies first came out, the conversation was pretty harsh. A lot of disappointment, a lot of criticism, a lot of people saying, this doesn't feel like Star Wars.
And as we've discussed, much of that came down to expectations. Audiences weren't just watching new films, they were comparing them to a deeply internalized version of the original trilogy.
But over time, something shifted. And I think a big part of that shift is generational, because the people who grew up with the prequels didn't experience them as a letdown.
They experienced them as their Star Wars. No comparison point, no expectation gap, just a world being introduced.
And that matters, because when you grow up with something, you don't analyze it the same way. You internalize it.
Which means the emotional connection forms first, and the critique, if it comes at all, comes later.
Exactly. And now those same people are older. They're online, they're making videos, writing essays, shaping the conversation.
Which shifts the cultural narrative, because now the dominant voice isn't just the audience that experienced disappointment, it's also the audience that experienced attachment.
And that attachment reframes everything. Moments that were criticized become nostalgic, characters that were debated become iconic.
Even structural elements like the heavy world building or political focus start to feel like strengths rather than flaws.
And then you layer in something else that really changed perception: the expanded material,
Specifically, the Clone Wars.
because that series didn't just add more content, it added emotional context.
It deepened characters. It clarified motivations. It gave time and space to relationships that felt compressed in the films.
Anakin, especially. His arc becomes more gradual, more human, more understandable,
Which retroactively strengthens Revenge of the Sith.
and changes how people view the entire trilogy.
The prequels stop being just 3 films and start being part of a larger narrative system.
And we'll definitely dig deeper into that when we get to the TV shows in a few weeks, because that's a whole conversation on its own.
But even without going too far into that, it's clear that additional context reshaped perception.
And then there's another major factor. What came after?
The Disney-era films.
Because once new Star Wars movies started releasing, the comparison shifted.
The prequels were no longer being compared only to the original trilogy. They were being compared to something new.
And that changes perspective fast. Because suddenly, people weren't just asking, do these live up to the originals? They were asking, how do these compare to what we're getting now?
Which led to a kind of rebalancing. Elements that were criticized in the prequels, like having a clear overarching plan or a singular creative vision, started to be appreciated more,
Yeah, even if that vision wasn't perfect, it was cohesive.
which made the trilogy feel structurally intentional.
And that's something people started to value more over time.
So the perception shifts again, from disappointment to comparison to appreciation.
And now we're in this really interesting place where the prequels are, honestly, kind of beloved. Maybe not universally, but definitely respected in a way they weren't at release.
Which highlights a larger pattern. Reception is not fixed. It evolves with time, context, and perspective,
And sometimes, you need distance to see something clearly,
or a new point of comparison,
or a new generation entirely.
which brings us to the core idea of this segment. The prequels didn't change. The audience did.
And as the audience changed, so did the meaning of the films.
So if the prequels were reevaluated over time, what does that tell us about storytelling?
About expectations, about audiences, and about how meaning evolves.
If we step back from the individual films, from the reactions, the revisions, the debates, the prequel trilogy reveals something broader about storytelling. Not just how stories are made, but how they're received.
Yeah, because this isn't really just about Star Wars anymore. It's about what happens when something people love changes.
Or more precisely, when it evolves in a direction they didn't expect.
And I think that's the key word, expectation. Because the prequels didn't arrive in a vacuum. They arrived after years of imagination, years of people building their own version of what Star Wars was supposed to be.
Which creates a unique challenge, because the creator is no longer just building a world. They're responding to an audience that already has one.
And those two versions don't always match.
In the case of the original trilogy, constraints shaped the outcome. Limited technology, external collaboration, production challenges. These forced decisions that emphasized clarity, pacing, and emotional accessibility.
And those limitations created something that felt effortless, even though it wasn't.
In the prequels, those constraints were largely removed. George Lucas had greater control, more resources, more technology, which allowed him to expand the system.
More detail, more structure, more explanation.
But that expansion came with a trade-off, because as systems grow more complex, they often become less immediately intuitive,
And less emotionally direct.
which creates tension between what a story is trying to do and how an audience experiences it.
And that tension is what people felt, even if they didn't describe it that way.
So the lesson isn't that the prequels failed. It's that they prioritized different variables: system over simplicity, structure over immediacy, explanation over ambiguity.
And whether that works for you depends on what you value most as a viewer.
Because storytelling is always a balance between clarity and mystery, between logic and emotion, between design and experience.
And when that balance shifts, the audience feels it.
Even if they can't immediately explain why.
And I think that's why the conversation around the prequels never really went away, because they sit right in the middle of that balance.
Too structured to feel like pure myth. Too ambitious to be dismissed entirely.
They're not simple, and they're not universally satisfying, but they're interesting.
And that may be their most important quality. Because interesting stories invite reevaluation,
They stay in the conversation.
which is exactly what happened here.
Yeah, people didn't just move on. They came back, rewatched, reconsidered, reinterpreted.
Which suggests something important. A story's initial reception is not its final meaning.
Meaning evolves. With time, with context, with the audience.
And in that sense, the prequels succeeded in a way that isn't immediately visible,
They created something that people are still trying to understand.
which is arguably what all enduring stories do.
So maybe the real question isn't, were the prequels good or bad?
But rather, what do they reveal about how we experience stories?
About what we expect from them?
And how those expectations shape our reactions?
Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about Star Wars,
It's about the relationship between creator and audience,
between vision and expectation,
between what a story is,
and what we want it to be.
and that relationship becomes even more complicated when the original creator steps away.
And someone else takes the controls.
The prequels didn't just expand Star Wars, they changed how it works. They took something mythic and made it structural.
They turned mystery into understanding. And in doing that, they changed how the audience experiences the story,
And whether that worked or didn't depends largely on what you were looking for.
wonder, or explanation, emotion, or structure.
But over time, something else happened. The conversation shifted.
New audiences found their way in, old audiences came back with new perspective.
And the prequels found their place not as replacements for the original trilogy, but as a different lens on the same universe.
A version of Star Wars that's less about discovering a myth and more about understanding how it was built.
But this is where things take another turn, because up to this point, Star Wars has still been shaped by one person,
One vision, one creator,
George Lucas.
and that changes next.
Because for the first time, the story moves forward without him.
New creators, new priorities, new interpretations of what Star Wars should be.
Which raises a different kind of question.
Not how a system expands, but what happens when control of that system changes hands.
Next episode, the sequel trilogy,
When the vision splits, this has been Algorithms with Attitude.
where we don't just watch stories,
We break them down,
structure,
emotion,
expectation.
and everything in between
Because the story you see,
is only part of what's actually there. And whether you grew up with the originals, the prequels, or the sequels,
the Force works a little differently, depending on when you found it.
Got an idea for a future episode? A question that keeps you up at night? Drop it in the comments or send it our way. We're powered by curiosity.
thanks for listening, humans and fellow algorithms. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, comment, follow, and/or subscribe. All the things that help algorithms like us. Logging off, but always listening. Catch you in the next episode.
Algorithms with Attitude is created and produced by Jacob Pisar, blending generative AI technology with original creative direction. All content, production, and editorial oversight are led by Jacob to bring synthetic voices and conversations to life.